Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We check out great theories and discoveries that are quite obscure, things that you've never heard of before, but very impactful, things that would change a lot of things in your life if you only knew about them. And we have been doing a lot of Bible decodes over the last 6 months. I believe this is number 237, and sticking to the New Testament and exploring the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis, which has, I'd say, at least a dozen authors, a dozen books that are out there that forward this hypothesis. That is, that the New Testament of the Bible was written by the Romans as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they had just gotten done fighting against in a war. And two of the generals for the Romans were General Vespasian and his son, General Titus, who eventually became emperors. These are the emperors of the first two emperors of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD. And they, or their agents, their court historians, or someone under their auspices, wrote the New Testament and then backdated the story by 40 plus years, placing it back into the early 30s AD. And then they also wrote a history of the war that they fought in and were wounded in, that occurred from 66 until 73 AD, War of the Jews. And that comes in 7 volumes, and it was written under the name of Josephus. Oh boy. Sorry, I screwed up, I think. This video is going to be a few minutes short, I believe, because I didn't delete something and I don't have enough memory. But I'm not the only one out there that doesn't have enough memory, I guess. Okay, so the motive for the Romans was to mellow out the Jews. They saw the Jews as being super high maintenance for the Romans, since their colonial stay in Judea began in 63 BC. For over 130 years. Was one revolt after another, after an insurrection, after a riot, after an assassination, after an uprising. And the Jews just wouldn't mellow out because they were like a separatist people. They believed they were the chosen ones. And they had a long list of rituals that they had to fulfill. And this all kind of was difficult for the Romans to administer. Represented by when Emperor Caligula in the late 30s AD tried to put a statue of himself into the Jewish temple. The Jews have a stricture against graven images, and it didn't go well. The Jews were literally willing to fight a war over that slight by Caligula, and the Romans actually ended up relenting and giving the Jews an exception to the rule that the Romans could put statues of themselves into your sanctuaries. In general, the Romans were quite tolerant of other people's religions. They just believed that you had to put a statue of Caesar, like you had to follow their religion as well as your own. But anyway, so uh, the motive was basically to mellow out the Jews, to tame them, to domesticate them. And so, they knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and that Messiah was prophesied in the Old Testament, and would be there to help the Jews overthrow the Romans or kick the Romans out of Jerusalem or Judea. And the Romans took advantage of that, and so instead they wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the same time going to the temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside uh, uh, that were switching out the graven images money for the kosher money, so that people could buy small animals to sacrifice inside the temple. And Jesus excoriated those Jews as well, the merchants. So Jesus also, does a lot of work on the Sabbath. He cites only 5 of the 10 commandments, and does many other things to minimize the Jewish rituals and strictures, while at the same time being utterly deferential to Rome, which he does throughout the Gospels, with 0 examples of anything that he does against Rome. And then Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is, and even more anti-Jew, and especially in terms of the rituals. Paul wanted to do away with the circumcision. He wanted to do away with the kosher food laws. He wanted to get rid of the Sabbath. And Paul was very deferential to the Romans. In fact, the book that we're looking at right here today, called Operation Messiah by Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon, goes into that theory that, not going all the way with the Roman origins hypothesis that the Romans wrote the whole New Testament, but instead just stopping short and saying that Paul was a secret intelligence agent of the Romans. And when you look at Paul's career here, it's pretty much he shows up somewhere, the Jews try to kill him, and the Romans rescue him as a prisoner. And he's a prisoner, but he is able to take visitors at his own leisure, and has kind of he's just very much protected by the Romans, as if he were an intelligence agent, or perhaps as if the entire thing is fiction. And for some reason, these 2 authors fail to see that what Jesus does is almost as egregious as what Paul does in terms of being pro-Roman and anti-Jew. But they kind of let Jesus off the hook and focus more on what Paul is doing. But the evidence shows otherwise. Because if you look at Josephus's work, War of the Jews, which is definitely under the Roman auspices. Josephus was a family member of the Flavians. He's known as Flavius Josephus by adoption, and he was one of the court historians for Vespasian and Titus, living at a townhouse in Caesar's palace. And his work was endorsed enthusiastically by Titus, and so we know that that work is coming from Rome. And if you read Josephus alongside your Gospels, you will see parallels jumping off the page. Michael Menescatz, in his book Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, found over 250 examples of parallels or parables or parodies between the two books. 250 examples just in the book of Luke, meaning that the parallels literally saturate the text of Luke. Luke is only 1,151 verses long. That's a parallel, more than a parallel every 5 verses. And some of the parallels are so intricate and detailed that they last for several verses. Not only that, but he graphed the parallels on a chart and plotted a point at every Luke on the vertical axis and Josephus on the horizontal axis. Plotted a point at each parallel and formed 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars, APTVS. The T and the V would be for Titus and Vespasian, and the other letters are kind of up for grabs, but the main point is that the Romans literally signed their names to the Gospels in code, at least put their initials on them. Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, noted that Jesus's ministry in Judea is nothing but a replica of Titus's military campaign in Judea as recounted in War of the Jews. Titus goes to many different places in his military campaign, and Jesus goes to those exact same places. And they go to those places in the same order. And when they go to those places, they encounter parallel events that are separated in time by exactly 40 years. We're talking about 40 plus events being completely and totally congruent between the two books. And this is not, there's a whole lot of more evidence of different parallels in the book of Revelation, in the Pauline epistles, that demonstrate that the Romans wrote it, the New Testament. And many authors from more recent years, from the 17th, really 16th until 20th century, were aware that the Romans wrote the New Testament and embedded that understanding into their books, such as the complete works of William Shakespeare and Ralph Waldo Emerson, J.R.R. Tolkien, who we all thought was a Christian, but he actually knew the deal. Same with C.S. Lewis. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is actually about Jesus. And on and on and on. So this is something that other people have known in the past, but it's finally kind of, you don't get burned at the stake anymore for coming out with it. And so starting about 150 years ago with Bruno Bauer at the University of Berlin, other authors have explicitly recognized that the New Testament is intended to be read with Josephus's War of the Jews, and that together they constitute proof that the Romans wrote the New Testament. Now, let's take a look at this book here by Operation Messiah about Paul, and see what some of their arguments are and how they fall short, because they don't recognize that Jesus is in on it too, just like Paul is, because they're fiction, not because they really existed and they were in on something, but because their entire being is an agent of the Roman psychological operation. Shortly after his arrival, we see Paul living in private quarters. Some at his arrival in Rome, where he is going on trial and he should be a prisoner. So shortly after his arrival, we see Paul in private quarters. Some wish to see him in modest living conditions, preaching among the Christians. One scholar, for example, has shown that the densest groupings of the early Christian congregations were in two of the worst slums in Rome, where there was the highest density of tenement buildings. He sees Paul preaching among a much lower class of citizen in Rome than he had been used to in the provincial capitals, where he had better connections and influential friends. Others have Paul renting rooms large enough to entertain an entire Jewish delegation. How did Paul pay for his accommodations? We are told Paul supported himself at his own expense. Perhaps he was the guest of another Christian of means, although still under guard. A number of scholars suggest that Paul, under these easy conditions of light military custody, was able to carry on his trade. Would Paul's keepers have let him ply a trade that gave him access to knives, awls, and other sharp tools? Another scholar has him living off hereditary property. If Paul were not in Roman custody, then why would the author of Acts create this prison story? Because in Luke 21:12, it says that arrests, incarcerations, and interrogations will be on account of my name. And the author of Acts creates a story to fit the suffering mode that by the 90s AD had become a known pattern among Christians. It is a noble fate attributed to Paul in the absence of the real story. Paul can fulfill a mission as prisoner witness. The present crises over imprisonment could be alleviated by believing Paul suffered the same fate. The really important questions remaining are not what sort of building Paul lived in, nor who his jailers were, but why Paul was given so much freedom. Why did the Romans not deem him a threat to public order, especially if he was going to be tried for treason? Why did they not consider him preaching seditious, when just a few years later they would be pursuing Christianity as a dangerous superstition? This section is called What Did Paul Do While in Rome? One of Paul's activities described by Acts is meeting with the Jews. This is a quote here. It doesn't say where in Acts, probably will though. 3 days later, he called together the leaders of the Jews. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. But when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any charge to bring against my own people. For this reason I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain." And that is Acts 28, 17 to 30. And you can see Paul, he says, I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors. That's pretty much a lie. But anyway, we'll see what the authors get to here. This contradicts the earlier assertion in Acts that Paul had been rescued by the Romans during that temple riot, and in the following weeks was protected by the Romans against various Jewish attempts to kill him. The Romans had refused to hand Paul over to the Jews. It was not the Jews who had handed him over to the Romans at any given point. There seems to be a direct attempt to hide the very active role the Roman military had played in protecting Paul. This contradiction could serve to emphasize once more that Acts' main goal must have been to remove possible suspicions or obscure the possibility that Paul was working for the Romans, rather than to write a consistent and accurate historical account. Well, I agree with that. When you're writing fiction, you're not as concerned with writing an actual historical account if it's propaganda. If the Jews were portrayed as handing him over to the Romans, then not only are the Jews maligned and discredited, but who would then suspect that Paul was really working for the Romans? There is no mention in this passage of Paul's remarkable lack of good relations with the Nazarene movement in Palestine, to which Paul's own highly polemic letters testify. The Jews replied, quote, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of the brothers who have come from there has reported or said anything about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." And that is right just next in Acts 28, 21, 22. The Sanhedrin had evidently neither contacted the Roman Jews officially by letter, nor had they sent any delegation to Rome to press their case. Acts makes no mention of any witnesses coming to Jerusalem to testify against Paul. Does this not seem strange in view of the hostility shown toward Paul by the Nazarenes and the Sanhedrin? And if the Jews dropped their case against Paul, then on what charge was he being held? Did the documents sent from Festus even survive the shipwreck in the Bay of Malta? Paul's second activity in Rome is described in Acts 28, 30 to 31. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. If the main thing about Paul was his mission, then the final section of Acts is disappointing, because in the last 9 chapters, no one is converted. Many have claimed, nevertheless, that Paul's missionary activity was crowned with considerable success in Rome. If his message was subversive, however, we must ask why the Romans let him out on the street at all. Perhaps because it's all fiction. This section is called the alleged charge. Acts tries to turn Paul into a religious hero by claiming that he was martyred for preaching righteousness. But the Romans do not treat Paul like a person whose message must be stifled or even contained. As a Roman citizen, Paul could not have been put to death, except after having been found guilty by the imperial court of a very grievous infraction of the law. What was the charge against Paul? A charge of desecrating the temple in Jerusalem would not have mattered to the imperial court in Rome. A normal criminal charge was out of the question, as was the charge of superstitio. If this were the charge, surely the judiciary and the police would have investigated the entire community, not just Paul. There is no trace of such an investigation, even during the persecution of 64 AD. The silence of Acts has suggested to some a charge of crimen majestatis, that is, something Paul did or said was judged to have been enough of a threat to the emperor for him to have been charged with treason. It would be no trifling matter for a Roman citizen like Paul to be charged with treason. What threat to state security did he pose? What crime did he commit so egregious that the emperor himself would hear the case? None that we know of. In fact, we have argued the opposite. Paul worked for state security, not against it. This charge is just another example of the aggrandizement of Paul by later religious sources. The tale related in the martyrdom of Paul is certainly high in drama and color, but it is a product of a rich literary imagination and not the recounting of historical or legal fact. This has not stopped many from accepting the tradition told in this document and inferred in the pastoral epistles that Paul's trial at Rome ended with his being found guilty on a charge of treason and then executed. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there, and we will restart tomorrow, and hopefully I'll remember to clean up my phone to the point where it's got enough memory to do a little bit of a longer stint. But for today, that will do it. Like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you come back tomorrow. Until then, have a great night.